Hi, all. Thanks for joining us today. My name's Sumit, and I'm a 2L at UVA Law. I'm the chapter president there for like a couple more weeks, and I'm excited right now to be joined by three wonderful panelists. So I'm joined by Heather Hamill, who's an attorney at the People's Law Firm. Heather grew up in a multiracial family, and seeing her siblings treated differently based on their varying appearances to the outside world, that all left an imprint on her at a relatively young age. And by the time she was a teenager, she realized that what might be a routine traffic stop for her as a white passing woman was very different for her younger brother with darker skin. Heather attended Berkeley, and at that time, she had the opportunity to witness in the dawn of the movement for Black Lives following the murder of Oscar Grant at Fruitvale Station. She witnessed Oakland PD's violent response to the Occupy protests. And after 3 years in the Bay Area, Heather brought her activism into her judicial clerkship with the Arizona Court of Appeals and an associateship with the national law firm Perkins Coie. While deeply appreciative for the mentorship of several outstanding attorneys at Perkins, Heather wanted to make a bigger impact than life at a big law firm would allow. With no prior nonprofit experience, Heather resigned from her six-figure associate position and formed Justice That Works, 501c3 dedicated to prison abolition. JTW aimed to end mass incarceration in Arizona through a lens of community accountability. During her 5 years in the nonprofit world, Heather continued to engage in community activism, participating in Valley protests against anti-immigrant legislation, advocating for police and corrections reform, and traveling to Standing Rock to be in solidarity with the indigenous water protectors protesting the Dakota Access Pipeline. And then in 2018, PLF lured Heather away from her nonprofit and activism work to return to the full-time practice of law. Moving seamlessly from frontline activism to legal advocacy, in just 2 years, Heather has served as a lead counsel on the largest civil rights settlement in the history of the city of Phoenix, second chaired a federal civil rights trial, led litigation on a number of Section 1983 civil rights matters, and helped author proposed criminal justice reform legislation for the Arizona State Legislature. Also joined by Riley Summers Flanagan, who's a founder and executive director for Upper Seven Law. Before founding Upper Seven Law, Riley served as Montana Governor Steve Bullock's deputy chief legal counsel, not only defeating the Trump campaign and election-related litigation, but winning 2 other cases against the administration over the course of a few short months. Riley also worked as a fellow for the nationally renowned class action firm Cohen Milstein and as the Supreme Court Assistance Project Fellow for the Public Citizen Litigation Group. Before that, she clerked for the Honorable Sidney R. Thomas, Chief Judge of the Ninth Circuit, and for Judge Ellen Siegel Huvel and Judge Thomas Hogan of the U.S. District Court of the District of Columbia. Riley graduated from Stanford Law School, where she was also the president of the Stanford student chapter of ACS. So we have an ACS here as well. We're also joined by Sunny Waknin. Am I saying your last name correctly? Waknin. Okay, apologize. She's a managing attorney and voting rights counsel at UCLA Voting Rights Project. And Sunny believes that to ensure an equitable democracy, elections must be free, fair, and devoid of systemic racism. Voting is the right that preserves all other rights and must be defended. Joaquin is responsible for managing academic research, legal scholarship, and policy work of the Voting Rights Project. She's currently counsel on Soto Palmer et al. V. Hobbs et al., Reyes v. Chilton, Portugal et al. V. Franklin County et al., and her proudest moment of her practice has been defending the constitutionality of the Washington Voting Rights Act from a legal challenge at the district court level. I see here that you've wanted to be a voting rights litigator since you were in high school, so clearly this is something you know a lot about. But thanks, y'all. I've talked enough. At this point, really, I just want to invite all of you to share a little bit more about your work, kind of like on a day-to-day level, high level also. Just what is it that you do? How would you describe it to folks?
So I just want to point out that it's all really awesome women who speaking. Will say my work is kind of varies day to day. One thing I've been doing a lot more. I've been going to trial. I think about anywhere from maybe at least once this year to 3 times a year, just on changing depending on discovery and other fun issues that you get to deal with. But I think the trial practice is really different. That day to day was really great. So you're kind of finishing up, you're getting exhibits together, you're dedicating depositions. And it's all a learning experience. So I'm actually in my third year of practice now. I've got to do one nice thing about voting rights work or not nice thing about voting rights work is that it never settles. People don't really want to be able to vote power, but usually and so you're always kind of getting to trial. But what that means is that you get a lot of experience, especially with our attorney. I work at the UCLA Voting Rights Project, which is out of the typical public affairs. They also have a legal clinic. So I work with my two bosses, and they have students. And so I manage casework. I help students learn what it means to be a practicing lawyer, working on election litigation. And so a lot of the time I answer their questions and figuring out what is good casework for them. So what is something that you all can learn and you're interested in, but I don't want to know what you do. So it definitely varies. And I would say right now, most of my casework is just getting to slog through, looking at other people's
So if it's okay, I just made a comment about what Upper Southern does because the name may not give it away. So I founded Upper Southern Law in just 2 years ago, in February 2021. And the didn't even remember that. So good.
Oh, it wasn't on. It's yeah. I think yours wasn't on either.
Oh, I just have a loud voice.
Okay. I was like, I just don't hear the microphone happening, but maybe it is. Okay, cool. So Upper Seven Law. I graduated from law school in 2016. And in that moment, I think maybe everyone remembers what happened in 2016. I was clerking for a federal judge, and I was in a position where I was not able to do much in terms of activism or take a stand on anything in any public way. I became a vegetarian for a year because it was the only thing I felt like I had any control over. And I mostly share that to just say that I think there can be these real moments of frustration in our careers, and that as we are transitioning out of being a student, we want to sort of hit the ground running, but there is time. And also it's good to see what you want and like what is going to bring you joy and what will move you to feel like your work is joyful in addition to hopefully meaningful in the bigger world. So I did a lot of jobs that were 1 year long. And I think it's really cool that Sunny has jumped into something so quickly that she's getting to develop so many skills doing. And I just want to point out that they're different models and they're both really good models. I did a lot of these jobs that took about a year. And then I moved home to Montana to work for Governor Bullock. And that was a really exciting time in my life because I got to do a ton of super substantive work really quickly. In fall of 2020, in the elections in 2020, Montana had a red wave. It looked a lot like the country did in 2016. And from my perspective, I think that anytime that you have single party rule, it doesn't matter who that party is, but single party rule lends itself to overreach and it lends itself to power grabs, and it doesn't check itself well. So the sort of essence of separation of powers and three branches, they don't work the ways that they should when you don't have some give and take between the branches. We also then in 2022 elected a supermajority of Republicans to the Montana state legislature. And so that's a whole new game that we are watching unfold. Historically, Montana has been pretty purple. So we have a bench that is deep with thoughtful judges who are serious about the law. We also have a constitution that was written in 1972. It means that it's an incredibly modern, exciting document that protects people's rights in one of the most sort of, it's just incredibly broad. And I also encourage you to look it up. It's online and easy to find, but even more fun than that, you can look at all of the constitutional transcripts for the Montana Constitution if you ever wanted to do that. The reason that I'm telling you all of this is that I decided to found Upper 7 Law because I felt that it was important to give the judicial branch an opportunity to weigh in on what the heck was going on in Montana. And it was also important to have an opportunity to be a generalist in a space that I think really required a public interest generalist to come in and be available to people to vindicate rights without motivation, being motivated by financial incentives. And so we have raised money in order to exist as a nonprofit, also a 501c3. And we litigate all the time. We challenge laws all the time. We're doing prison conditions cases. We have invalidated 4 laws so far. We have a consent decree coming down from the Secretary of State's office that will, it will require the Secretary of State's office to automatically refund overcharges of small businesses. Sounds like a small issue, and in some ways it is, but it's also just like a really basic, if you overcharge someone, you should give them their money back kind of a thing. It doesn't pass a smell test is one way that I would think about it. So we have had this sort of wide-ranging and exciting set of experiences. Now that the 2023 legislative session is in, Montana has a legislative session that meets every other year. And during this session, they have committed themselves to extremely transphobic legislation, in addition to legislation that guts voting rights, in addition to legislation that targets environmental groups across the state, in addition to, and we could go on. I think that what that means for us is that we have a huge amount of work in our future. One really exciting thing is, and maybe a cautionary tale, is that we haven't actually lost yet. We have won, I think we're now at 8 cases. And I feel like I didn't think about how to tell this in the most organized way. And so I'm excited for all of your questions, and I want to pass it on to Heather. And I'm so excited to hear about your organization that you founded. But I guess I think that what I really am excited to be here to tell you all is that, like, there is this opportunity out there in states that don't have, you don't need to go to New York or DC or LA to do exciting and important work. And I just remember that, you know?
Well, I hope I didn't rush you, because
No, I started to get nervous. I was like, it's too long.
Well, that was really compelling. And yes, you don't have to go to New York or DC to do really compelling work. So my name's Heather Hamill. I probably practice law in one of the weirdest ways. I don't meet many attorneys who practice law in the ways that I do, or the way that we do at PLF. And so I'm really excited to get to be an example of what practicing law maybe could look like in all of its various iterations. So, you know, like was said, I started out as an activist. Actually, I've been an activist for a long time, starting here in Arizona, protesting against Arpaio, protesting against SB 1070. That, you know, activism continued as much as I could while I was in law school. And then when I came back to Arizona, it started back up again. But I have a really weird career path. I went to big law, was there for just a short amount of time, and then left and was back out on the streets again. And when I mean activism, I mean like frontline activism, community organizing, but also some of the folks who are on the ground, on the streets. I actually met my boss at the People's Law Firm after I chained myself to the governor's building here in Arizona. And he showed up at the jail and was like, hey, tell me a little bit about your background so I can argue for release conditions. And I was like, well, I went to Berkeley Law. And he was like, what? Why are you chaining yourself to the governor's office? And I was like, the real question is, why aren't you? And so he kind of convinced me to not necessarily stop the activism, but to use that to inform what could be a practice of law. And I'm really grateful for the opportunities at the People's Law Firm to do that. So what we do at the People's Law Firm, we're a civil rights boutique. But the reason that I got brought in is because so many organizing strategies, so many organizing tactics actually can be used really well and are complementary to litigation. And it makes the practice against really repressive big state institutions when you're a two-person law firm a little bit more fair, I should say. But so that's what I do is I litigate by bringing in organizing tactics, which includes, campaign strategies, which includes comm strategies, which includes protest strategies. All of those strategies are about creating leverage and building pressure to try to get a result, which is exactly what you try to do in litigation every day. Also, because of our close ties to movement here in Arizona, I think we've I don't really love using the term movement lawyer, but I guess that would maybe be the best way to describe sort of what we do. So day-to-day can look like a million things. During the uprisings, day-to-day looked like doing legal observing out on the street, getting tear gassed every night, changing clothes, showing up at the courthouse at 2 a.m. to do initial appearances for folks who had been arrested, changing clothes again, showing back up at the office at 8 a.m. And trying to fight criminal charges that folks were bringing. So one of the proudest pieces of work of my life was around the 2020 uprisings here in Arizona, when police and prosecutors conspired to try to make up this fictional street gang that they then tried to charge BLM demonstrators as being a part of. And that fictional street gang was a street gang that they called the ACAB street gang, which is as ridiculous as it sounds.
Like ACAB.
Yeah, yes, like the acronym for all cops are bastards. They claimed that was an actual gang that existed, that BLM demonstrators and protesters were members of, which is like really funny in hindsight. But at the time, those are really serious criminal syndicate charges. And, there were some folks who were facing decades in prison because of that. There were some folks who were facing centuries in prison because of the ways in which they were stacking the charges. And so we were a really integral part in coordinating the political legal defense strategies to get all of those charges dropped, and not only to get all of those charges dropped, but to hold all of the police and prosecutors who were involved in that accountable. So out of that, there were 160 felony charges that were eventually thrown out or dismissed by the court. There were, as you all know, the county attorney here had to resign. After that became public, 2 bureau chiefs at the county attorney's office were forced to resign. The lead prosecutor on that case was fired. The chief of police retired early. 3 assistant chiefs of police were demoted. There was the specialized prosecutor unit that brought those charges was disbanded. And there were a series of new policies that were put into place, both at the police department and at the county. And then the DOJ came in. But the only way that we were able to accomplish all of those goals is because we weren't just working those cases strictly from a criminal defense standpoint. And we included, a lot of organizing and comm strategies around that. And a lot of that makes a lot of lawyers uncomfortable. Hey, are you going to do a pack the courthouse demonstration at a bond hearing? But you should, because it gets results. So that's what we do now. We're actively litigating those cases, but we also do a lot of national mass defense, protest defense nationwide now. So the next place that we're in right now is we're currently in Atlanta, supporting local community groups on the ground who are opposing the construction of Cop City in Atlanta. And I don't know if any of you know what's going on there, but 42 demonstrators have now been charged as domestic terrorists, which again, very serious charges that carry the possibility of 35 years to life. It's a major escalation in state repression. These tactics are used to try to intimidate and silence movements. And so that's what our work really focuses on, is trying to protect the individuals who are making change in our country, because if they cannot be protected from this type of really intense state repression, then that work cannot continue and our movements will get dismantled. So that's the work that we do. And it looks like a million different ways, from being out on the streets to talking with media, to like making documentaries, to filing briefings. It's kind of this weird catch-all practice, but I really love it, and I'm super excited to talk about it with all of you. So thank you so much for having me.
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. No, this is like incredible work that all of y'all are doing. And I had a quick follow-up to that, which is, you spoke a little bit, Heather, to like the comm strategies and whatnot that you're using. Specifically, like what kinds of comm strategies are you using, right? And then Riley, the question for you as well.
So it's everything from like creating graphics, right? Like social media graphics that get used as public ed, holding public ed nights, so that people can learn about what's happening in their communities, what is the state doing, and can also include, things like thinking through the use of media. Obviously, there's constraints on that. But we also do, at our firm, we do make mini documentaries, which again, like I said, is this weird. As when I was in law school, if you had told me I'd be making mini documentaries, I would have been like, well, what am I doing here? But we do make mini documentaries. Obviously, comm strategies can get complicated. Oftentimes you do that in coordination with community, because, community organizations have much less restrictions than attorneys do. But I mean, really everything from social media to print media to film, we at least think through what that can look like. So our media strategy has been sort of interesting. We, in the sense that we really believe in engaging media, and we really think that that's important. And simultaneously, there hasn't been, because we are so focused on legal issues, it hasn't ended up being essential to get people super involved in that piece of it just yet. We test out different times when we think, okay, should we be engaged more in the communication side of things. I think that the panel that preceded us was super interesting for this, that talking about that all of the opportunities that exist, I think, in litigation to share stories with the community and to amplify the stories of the community through your litigation. So we issue press releases for all of the major things that happen in our cases. And we have a great press list. And one of the things that's really fun about that is that we get pretty darn good press coverage. And then when, for example, the Secretary of State was negotiating the consent decree with us, the only thing that they wanted was that we would not issue a press release. So we didn't, and we aren't going to, but go ahead and watch for that. And you all feel free to tweet about it. And so one thing I didn't actually manage to say, so Upper 7 Law, our mission is to hold the powerful accountable. Right now, we have essentially two practice groups. One of those practice groups is a state watchdog group where we really focus on state conduct. And that can take the form of laws being passed. It can take the form of prison conditions, and it can take the form of, a state or a municipality or a county sort of engaging in unconstitutional behavior. And so those are the categories that fall into that. We also have our moonshot practice, and we have far fewer cases that fall into this category, but this is one where media was really fun. So the moonshot practice is hard to bring cases that need to be brought. A lot of people that you have heard from today are doing those types of cases. We are far from being alone in I think, trying to sort of
bravely take on cases that may be very, very challenging or very involved. There is a person in Montana. He is no longer actually in Montana because he left after we sued him. He was an alt-right conservative pastor named J.D. Hall, who he founded an online Christian magazine called Protestia, and he founded a so-called news organization called the Montana Daily Gazette. You can imagine that sounds like a news organization. He also wrote an article called Who is the Gothic Transvestite Haunting the Halls of the Montana State Capitol? Sounds like news to me. In that article, he described our client as having attacked a state legislator. She did not attack a state legislator, and that's defamation because it is harmful speech that is untrue. One of the things that was the most important as we litigated this case was actually having our client stay completely silent, because J.D. Hall was all over the internet saying completely insane things, among them that he wanted to put our co-counsel's head on a wall, threatening the judge that it was ultimately assigned to. And when we filed a sanctions hearing or a sanctions motion against him and a hearing was set, he declared bankruptcy the Friday before the hearing. When you declare bankruptcy, it presses pause on all litigation against you. And we all looked at each other and we said, oh shit, we're not bankruptcy lawyers. What are we going to do? But it turns out that when you have a case against someone in bankruptcy, you also have, and they declare bankruptcy, you then have a claim in their estate. So we were an unsecured creditor in his estate. A series of crazy things happened to J.D. Hall, which were covered by a local Montana newspaper in a long form article that was absolutely glorious and described his essential ousting from the state. He was excommunicated from the church where he was a pastor. He was pulled over and found he was pulled over for drunk driving. Turned out that he was high on some form of prescription drug, and proceeded to literally flee the state. But before he fled the state, he issued a public retraction and apology to our client. And after he fled the state, he paid her $25,000 from his unsecured estate. Yeah. So we didn't do that much media, but it was cool.
No, that's incredible. I want to read this long form piece now. I'm curious. I got one last question for y'all, which Heather, you spoke to this a little bit earlier, but like, what's the proudest moment of your career so far, right? In terms of career milestones, work that you've done, I'd love to hear.
I can go for that. I think it changes all the time. I will say there's like an overarching theme. So like my first year of practice, I think my proudest moment was getting to work on a Supreme Court brief. Like that was so cool to me. That was something I could never even imagine. I am the first person in my family to go to college, went to law school, knowing I wanted to be a voting rights lawyer, but thinking that I had people who told me going into law school, you know, there are places and firms that get to work on Supreme Court briefs, and where you're at, you're probably not going to get to do that. And so that was really, you know, you feel that like fight and you're like, what do you mean? Like, I won't get to do that. And so that was really proud for me. And then my second year of practice was getting to having my boss let me first chair a deposition. My first deposition I took was the other side's expert, and took his deposition and got him to admit that the jurisdiction was violating the Voting Rights Act because he wasn't prepared and didn't know what they were fighting, what the issue was in the case. He'd said it during multiple public meetings actually to them, because we were fighting district. We wanted a at-large jurisdiction to go to districts. This guy is a demographer, so he just drew them districts. And so during every public meeting, they were like, well, why can't we keep at large? And he goes, because you'll be violating the Voting Rights Act. And so I listened and sat all those public meetings and was like, oh, can I play this to him during his deposition? They're like, yeah, you can do that. And so that was really a really proud moment, because they actually had to pull him as an expert and get someone else. And then I think recently maybe my proudest moment, besides I got to defend at the lower court level in state court the constitutionality of the Washington Voting Rights Act, but I also have gotten to do first chaired like over a dozen depositions and have, I'm going into trial and I get to take on one of the big bads in their cross-examination possibly. So I think all of that makes me really proud, but I think the proudest thing is that you have mentors throughout your legal career, and I think they vary in how involved they are with you. I was really lucky. My bosses are folks who I actually worked for as a student. I was one of their first law students in their clinic that they had founded, and my boss, Chad Dunn, really took me under his wing and wanted to hire me, and I went to work for him. And so I think him believing in me at every single step has been really proud for me, because he has been such a good mentor and teacher, and you don't really get that all that often. Someone willing to sit down with you and read your deposition transcript and say, hey, next time, like maybe don't say this or don't do this in your deposition, or I would, like here's maybe how you'll handle this person, or sit down with you, explain like why you wouldn't want to use a document during something that you're working on. But having I think your mentor and your boss really believe in you, to me, has made me so proud, like to be able to go in and be probably the youngest person on our co-counsel litigation team and be one of the people that gets to depose or cross-examine one of the most important witnesses, I think, in the case. It's been like really like outstanding.
I think you should go next. I'm really proud about ousting JD Hall.
Yeah. No, we can tell.
I think my proudest moment, like I said, was the work that we did around protecting protesters during the 2020 uprisings, and the work to expose what police and prosecutors were doing to try to systematically dismantle our local movement here in Phoenix. That's probably greatest work I've been involved in so far. And super excited to now take some of those lessons and strategies as these tactics are being used sort of around the country, and trying to figure out how to fight repressive state tactics around the country. So, yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, y'all. If we can get a round of applause for our panelists. At this point, really, like, it's open to y'all. For an audience Q&A, we can probably take at least like 2 or 3 questions. Are we good with 2 or 3? Okay, I lied. Okay, so Jordan, I'll leave it to you at this point.
Sure. So at this point, we're going to do a little bit different. We're going to have 3 panelists move up here in the part of the auditorium. And this is your chance for the next 15 minutes. And we got about a 15-minute break from 2:30 to 2:45. But it's your chance to just have a conversation, ask them real questions, and get real answers. Feel free to kind of float between folks too. You don't have to like just pick one. And especially we've got the break. So we do have 10-15 minutes outside for these conversations. But feel free to kind of hang out at the break and hear the discussion as well. So. Yeah, I think at this point, Robert, Dave, Peggy, we'll have you 3 go out and kind of make a B, and you get yourself selected. So you want to go?